The weekend before last saw the release of Shelby Oaks, the debut feature film from Chris Stuckman. Stuckman is best known as an online film reviewer with a massive following on YouTube. A large part of Shelby Oaks was funded through Kickstarter by fans of his channel. This is the third major release this year to be directed by a YouTuber. The Philippou brothers, an Australian duo known as Raka Raka on YouTube, released their sophomore feature, Bring Her Back, a horror starring Oscar nominee Sally Hawkins. Meanwhile, Kogonada, who established himself as an online video editor, released his third feature film, A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey, starring Oscar nominees Colin Farrell and Margot Robbie. It was also reported over the summer that following on from a small theatrical release for his feature-length season finale Night of the Coconut, YouTube film critic Patrick Willems would direct The Dinner Plan, a short starring Emmy nominee Zach Cherry, Emmy color commentator John Hodgman, and Emmy watcher Griffin Newman, who is also a pretty respectable actor in his own right. So it seems safe to say that something is happening. There is a palpable shift in the industry. Just like television, commercial, and music video directors before them, YouTube creators are coming to Hollywood. That's right, it's time for everybody's favorite topic, YouTubers talking about YouTubers. So this week, we are going to talk about that. We're going to look at the history of directors transitioning into film from other media, cinema's complicated relationship to new media in general and the internet in particular, the push and pull that Hollywood feels in trying to attract audiences drawn to this new media, and how these films from online media creators both are and are not necessarily what you'd expect them to be. Or at least I think they will. This week's episode is going to be a bit more stream of consciousness. I hope I don't get stuck, man. Now, before we begin, it's probably best to get this out of the way very quickly. This is not going to be some moral panic episode about how the sky is falling, how there's panic in the streets, and how suddenly dogs and cats have started living together. Platonically, of course. There has predictably been some pearl clutching online about granting this new generation access to the hallowed halls of film production, but the truth is that cinema has always recruited talent from other art forms. There's a long history of film critics like Paul Schrader transitioning into filmmaking. Francois Truffaut was famously kicked out of Cannes as a film critic because he was too mean, only to return the following year with his debut feature The 400 Blows and win the Palme d'Or.
Parce que quand je vais repasser, ce sera pas pour 30%. Quand je vais repasser, ce sera pour tout.
The 400 Blows also somehow contains perhaps the single most French shot in the history of cinema. There are novelists who became filmmakers, like Alex Garland, who's always seemed particularly funny to me because Garland's argument has always been that he was basically forced into becoming a director by the troubled production of Dredd.
After the experience of making Dredd, what I said is I am not doing that again. Just let me do that job.
That he sees himself as a writer first and foremost.
It suits me, and this period has suited me. I also liked writing for other directors. It's interesting. Now I know that other role in a more intimate way. Seeing that gap, that change between screenplay and a directed thing.
He's also the kind of director who says things like, he's not really a film director, he's a writer who directs out of convenience. And will do press announcing, I never wanted to be a director, I wanted to stop directors from changing things, and the only way to do that was by occupying that position of director. However, for a guy who talks so much about how he doesn't want to direct, Garland's movies are really director dependent. They're driven by strong directorial choices and visual design. And of course, even Stephen King has gotten in on the act. Even if the only reason that he has sole directing credit on Maximum Overdrive is because the DGA still refuses to recognize the creative contribution of cocaine.
And the thing is, at that time, I was doing a lot of cocaine, and I was drinking a lot.
You can tell with the movie, for sure.
Yeah, no, you can tell.
More to the point, some of the best directors in the history of the medium have come from television. Steven Spielberg cut his teeth directing early episodes of Columbo. His first theatrically released feature film, Jewel, was actually a television movie that was so good they re-released it to cinemas. Arthur Penn, the filmmaker generally credited with kickstarting the new Hollywood movement with Bonnie and Clyde, got his start directing televised plays. Richard Donner, who helped define the blockbuster with Superman and Lethal Weapon, worked in television for decades. He famously directed the Nightmare at 20,000 Feet episode of The Twilight Zone, which has become one of the show's defining episodes and was even adapted by George Miller for Spielberg's ill-fated Twilight Zone movie. And then there's like Sidney Lumet, who is a very interesting case. Lumet is one of the great American directors, and his guide to directing is one of the great books about filmmaking, and not only because it contains practical advice like, have a quick nap and a light sandwich at lunch to keep your energy up.
During lunch, Sidney would go to sleep. He would take a nap, have a small sandwich or something, and just go right to sleep.
Lumet stands out from many of his contemporaries who began in television because his early features carried over some of that television sensibility. His first feature, 12 Angry Men, is rightly regarded as one of the great American movies, but it could very easily have aired on television. Indeed, two of Lumet's earliest films, 12 Angry Men and Failsafe, were even adapted as television movies at the turn of the millennium. More than that, television was something of a recurring fixation for Lumet in his work, directing Dog Day Afternoon and Network back-to-back. Movies that are, at least in part, about the way that television had warped and distorted contemporary American culture.
Because you people and 62 million other Americans are listening to me right now. Because less than 3% of you people read books. Because less than 15% of you read newspapers. Because the only truth you know is what you get over this tube. Right now, there is an entire generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of this tube.
So, the arrival of these YouTubers into mainstream filmmaking is just part of how Hollywood evolves and shifts over time, drawing talent from new forms of mass media and seeing if they have anything to offer to movie making. Of course, the very direct influence of television on Lumet's work and Lumet's recurring engagement with television as a theme is very much the exception here. Most of the more famous directors who began in television adapted very quickly to the expansive, widescreen, action-driven spectacle of the big screen. Filmmakers like Spielberg, Penn, and Donner weren't just making movies. They were making the kinds of movies that distinguish film from other media like contemporary television. It's worth acknowledging that this wasn't always the case. In some instances, directors migrating from other media would carry over the sensibility of that medium with them. So during the 1990s, largely driven by the filmmaking collective Propaganda Films, there was an influx of directors from commercials and music videos into mainstream cinema. A lot of those directors carried over the aesthetic of music videos and advertisements, an emphasis on quick cuts, oppressive and occasionally overwhelming editing and scoring, strong dependence on atmosphere and mood, and striking and often impressionistic visuals. Hell, it's even obvious in the high-contrast cinematography of these music videos, with their heavy emphasis on warm sepias and cool blues. You could draw a straight line between the wet, grungy, chain-filled industrial setting of the Express Yourself music video and David Fincher's work on Alien 3. What are the eerie, anonymous cityscapes of videos like Express Yourself, and Who Is It, other than a dry run at the anonymous city of Seven? A city populated by the sorts of empty lofts in which David Fincher's music videos were often set. And even beyond Fincher himself, what is Aaron Burr but the text for Michael Bay's entire subsequent filmography? To be clear, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Many of those directors made incredible movies. But you can often feel that somebody like Michel Gondry or Alexis Proyas or even Zack Snyder began in music videos and commercials in a way that you couldn't necessarily feel that Spielberg, Penn, or Donner had begun in television. So the question remains, why were these music video directors different from the generation of television directors who came before them? And what does that mean for a new generation of internet-native creators arriving as directors in Hollywood? Are these YouTube creators termed film directors more likely to be like the music video and commercial directors who retain their stylistic sensibility when moving into film? Or are they more likely to be like the television directors who shed a lot of the aesthetics of that medium in order to make films? It is worth acknowledging that there was an incentive for music video and commercial directors to retain their stylistic sensibility in translating to film. That sort of hyperactive maximalist aesthetic works very well as spectacle. In contrast, there was a disincentive for television directors to retain their styles when they moved into film. This was largely driven by the fact that for decades, film had seen television as a competitor, a rival eating into the potential audience. If viewers could get entertainment at home for free, why would they bother going to theaters? By the way, stop me if any of this starts to sound at all familiar. This anxiety was a major motivating factor behind major technical innovations during the 1950s in an effort to eventize cinema, from gimmicks like the Tingler, to 3D, to formats like VistaVision. Hey, does any of that sound vaguely familiar to you guys? Hell, when promoting Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock came up with the then innovative idea that maybe audiences should see a movie from the beginning instead of just arriving whenever.
I've suggested that Psycho be seen from the beginning. In fact, this is more than a suggestion. It is required.
Even the widescreen aspect ratio, which we now associate with cinema, was a response to television, offering a format that couldn't be replicated on the square box available at home. Even in terms of content, you can see a healthy suspicion of television across the history of film, from jokes about how commercial presentation hacks movies into pieces.
Grand Hotel! But first, a word from our sponsor. If you smoke the modern way, don't be fooled by...
Through to more existential concerns about its influence on larger culture. Film skepticism about television, often bordering on paranoia, even continued into the 90s, suggesting that it was a corrosive and oppressive force. This also neatly coincides with the first wave of movies about how the internet is evil. But don't worry, we'll circle back around to that in a moment. The key point is that for more than half a century, cinema portrayed television as a fundamentally toxic influence on both the American mind and on American culture. There was even a resurgent mistrust of cable news in the mid-2010s. Gee, I wonder what could have caused that. There have been some interesting developments along this line. While for decades it fell to television to mythologize its own history and to tell its own stories, recent years have seen a number of high-profile feature films about the importance and the value of mass media television. It's quite something to see the creation of Saturday Night Live treated with the same respect that Hollywood usually reserves for, say, the guy who didn't invent Flamin' Hot Cheetos. It's also very bizarre that 1 year after Christopher Nolan adapted American Prometheus into Oppenheimer, Saturday Night claims that it was actually Lorne Michael who stole Promethean fire from the gods.
Who is that asshole anyway?
It's Prometheus. He stole fire from the cauldron of the gods, gave it to man so he could have science and the arts.
Television seems to be suddenly worth the self-regard that Hollywood usually reserves for movies about making movies. It's notable that 2 of the recent films about the moon landing place a lot of emphasis on the role that the television broadcast played as a unifying force in contemporary American politics. This comparatively sudden embrace of television as an art form that deserves celebration may be because film's skeptical gaze has shifted to a younger form of media. Where older films were wary of the outsized role that television played in shaping American culture, there have been a recent wave of films concerned about the insidious influence of the internet and social media. Suddenly, television has been transformed from a rival into a reluctant ally in the face of a new enemy. This is what makes the arrival of these YouTube creators into contemporary mainstream cinema so interesting. They're arriving into an industry that is caught in an existential conflict with platforms like YouTube and TikTok, competing for audience attention. The film industry largely doesn't know how to respond to the sheer volume of free content, often produced at a very high level, that is easily available to this new generation of consumer. Which is the person I'm actually addressing right now. How's it going? Hope everything's good. Cheers. In recent years, Hollywood has made painfully clumsy attempts to engage with this emerging audience. The most obvious example is the emergence of screen life, a style of filmmaking largely championed by director and producer Timur Bekmambetov. A spiritual descendant of the found footage horror boom of the 2000s, screen life presents the entire narrative through a computer screen overlay. It's an approach that has been most frequently applied to horror films because it's a cheap and easy conceit that provides a lot of opportunity for scares, but it can also be applied to other genres, like thrillers or mysteries, and even dramas about extremist recruiting or alien invasion epics.
This plan is humanity's last chance. I see no other option to initiate this war of the worlds to save us all.
Which also happen to be advertisements for Amazon.
Right here.
Oh, it's the future of delivery. They've been training us for months. I need you to place an official order on Amazon to activate the drone.
This is nuts.
You know, the full range of the human experience. These films vary in quality from enjoyable to agonizing, and it seems like Bekmambetov is still pushing the form, which looks to be a major part of his upcoming thriller Mercy, in which Chris Pratt is tied to a chair and forced to watch one of these Screen Life movies as he attempts to prove his innocence to an AI judge played by Rebecca Ferguson. They recently moved it from August to January, which just screams studio confidence and high quality. There have also been other obvious and clumsy attempts to capitalize on the popularity and success of online entertainment. Infamously, Quibi tried to produce short-form viral-friendly media, including such tasteful series as Murder House Flippers, a property show about selling crime scenes, and Dishmantled, in which blindfolded contestants tried to reverse engineer the ingredients of a dish after, well... It's a wonder it didn't catch on. Well, that and the fact that they had the misfortune to release an app designed to be enjoyed on the move in the middle of a massive global pandemic when everybody is locked down at home. That too. By the way, if you heard the premise of Quibi, which was the idea of short-form content delivered to a high professional Hollywood standard, and immediately thought to yourself, that sounds like an attempt to skirt around Hollywood labor regulations, well, you are a deeply, deeply, deeply cynical human being. You are also entirely correct. More recently, Amazon have partnered with MrBeast for a television show expansion of his online videos. But there is a recurring sense that this isn't how that media is going to transition into film and television. People who want to watch MrBeast or TikTok shorts can do so for free on their app without paying for a subscription. What's interesting is that Hollywood has found some success responding to the arrival of internet video in much the same way that it responded to television, by turning cinema into an event, emphasizing the aspects of the experience that can't be replicated at home or on the phone, with events like Barbenheimer, concert films from Taylor Swift and Beyoncé, and party screenings for films like the Minecraft movie. There's also been a renewed emphasis on immersive gimmicks from 4DX to 3D to formats like VistaVision. Hey, does any of that sound vaguely familiar to you guys? Even Mercy is releasing in 3D, and just last week, it was announced that IMAX were building 17 new screens in the US to meet demand for the release of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey next year. The kids, they yearn for the cinema. Not because it can do what streaming video does, but because it can do what streaming video can't. What is interesting about the arrival of YouTube creators like Kogonada and the Filippo brothers is that their work feels quite distinct from Hollywood's attempt to capitalize on internet video. When it comes to style, Kogonada and the Filippo brothers are not especially modern. Like the early directors who migrated from television to film, their approach is very traditionally cinematic. Kogonada's first film, Columbus, opens with a series of largely static compositions, still and almost symmetrical images that recall slow cinema. It's very still, and it's very quiet, the exact opposite of what an audience might expect from a creator who emerged on internet video. The Filippo brothers' first movie, Talk to Me, opens with an impressively complicated long take following a character through a house party. From the outset, these directors are announcing that their movies are real movies. These films are almost aggressively traditionalist when it comes to their production. Talk to Me and Bring Her Back are both metaphors about unprocessed grief involving parents and children that feel like the spiritual descendants of austere 70s art house horrors like Don't Look Now. The Filippos are massive movie nerds, with a clear love of the art form and its history, as can be gleaned from any conversation with them online.
Throne of Blood.
Wait, hold on, let me...
Alibaba.
Talking about letterbox nonsense, at one point in Bring Her Back, the Filippos literally extend the movie's aspect ratio into the IMAX ratio, which is exactly the sort of wonderful "this is a movie" calling card that Tom Cruise was pulling in The Final Reckoning, which was screening right across the hall in the cinema at the same time. I mean, say what you will about The Final Reckoning, but more blockbusters should contain a sequence in which Tom Cruise literally decompresses the screen to IMAX format. That's real movie magic stuff. As Justin Chong pointed out in his review for the Los Angeles Times, even the title of Kogonada's second film, After Yang, evokes the work of Asian cinematic legends Korida and Edward Yang. A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey is a love letter to the films of Hayao Miyazaki, and an attempt to translate some of that anime aesthetic into real life, complete with a score by frequent Miyazaki collaborator Joe Hisaishi. Kogonada is also in tune with contemporary indie cinema, to the point that After Yang opens with the most essential scene in any modern independent feature, the quirky dance scene. Oh yeah. The quirky dance number is as much a feature of American independent cinema as the aspect ratio shift is of larger scale cinema. It's been a feature since about Little Miss Sunshine in the early 2000s and has become a hallmark of what might be termed the Sundance indie. It's a great way to communicate that although your movie is dealing with heavy themes, it can also be fun. And it might also signify that, hey, your quirky lead characters, they're really quirky. But like the aspect ratio shift, it is also a way of signifying this is a movie, and a particular kind of movie at that. This is not to suggest that these directors aren't building off their work in internet video. Kogonada employs a lot of techniques that he discussed in his video essays. You look at his film and you can see the symmetry of Wes Anderson, the one-point perspective of Kubrick, the passages and corridors of Ozu. Often the framing in his movies is very similar to the shots that he pointed out in those videos. His stylistic and visual influences can be traced from his video essays into his films. On this note, it's also just worth acknowledging that YouTube can serve as a sort of impromptu self-taught film school. People like the Philip Poe brothers, and to a lesser extent Patrick Willems, are producing effectively short films. While they don't have the production machinery or the budget of a major studio behind them, they are learning the basics of film production on the fly in real time through trial and error. Even Kogonada, who didn't necessarily produce his own video, still made videos with an eye to filmmaking choices. So it makes sense that they would arrive on set with strong aesthetic ideas about the films that they want to make. On this point, it's worth noting that these films also just look good. Talk to Me is beautifully shot, with a really strong sense of light and darkness and shadow. The largely static shots in Columbus are constantly thoughtful. The almost but not quite symmetrical compositions, the almost square building, the walls that almost touch but don't, are a nice visual metaphor for the relationship at the center of the film, which is an almost relationship between two people who under different circumstances might connect, but in the context of this film never quite managed to do so. Kogonada communicates that idea as much through his visual design as through his narrative and dialogue. Just broadly, these movies look better than any number of contemporary films by directors with far more experience and far larger budgets and a much greater platform. And obviously, a lot of credit for how good these movies look and sound goes to the craftspeople involved, the cinematographer, the editor, the sound designer, and the various departments heads, and so on and so forth. But those are all chosen by and answer to the director. It's a truism that a large part of the job of any good director is simply having good taste. And these filmmakers do have good taste, largely honed by their experiences on YouTube. However, while these movies are arguably very traditional in their formalism, much more traditional in some ways than more mainstream blockbusters, it's interesting how they are in some ways modern in their content, perhaps reflecting the perspectives of filmmakers who emerged from internet video making. There's a clear sense that while these may not explicitly be films about the internet in the same way that screen life film could be.
Smartphone? Dumb human.
So you never use your phone?
For phone calls.
Right.
I have a dumb phone, no internet.
That's not even possible.
These are still engaged with the concerns and anxieties of creators familiar with internet videos. Kogonada has his own set of distinct recurring thematic preoccupations, like grief, mothers, and his own relationship with his Asian heritage.
What makes someone Asian?
Which, by his own admission, is complicated as a person who moved to the United States from Seoul as a child.
So how do you like being back in Seoul?
Also, he just really likes umbrellas in bright primary colors, which I'm sure is equally important to all that other stuff. Even accepting all of that distinct and unique personal stuff, Kogonada's movies are largely about the idea of mediation, characters engaging with the world through art. Casey, the young protagonist of Columbus, is a woman who loves architecture. She provides guided tours of the local sites, much as a film YouTuber might be said to guide their audience through the medium of cinema. However, her central journey over the course of the film is towards the realization that she doesn't just want to give tours of other people's art.
The problem with being a tour guide is that you stop seeking. Become some arbiter of tidbit facts that you'd start repeating over and over.
She wants to make it for herself.
Really? You want to become an architect?
Jin, the film's other protagonist, translates books, another career based on mediation between artist and audience, much like a tour guide or a video essayist. In After Yang, Jake, played by Colin Farrell, is a tea shop owner who fell in love with tea through the medium of film.
Yeah, I saw this old documentary when I was in college. It was from the 20th century. And it was about this man searching for the best tea in China.
And, much like the architecture in Columbus might read as a metaphor for the artistic power of cinema, and in particular the way that Kogonada constructs his shots.
The design, Saarland's design, Saarland's design is asymmetrical, yet still remains balanced.
Jake talks about tea as something with a meaning that transcends simple words, in the same way that, say, film does.
There's no language for it. There are no words to adequately express the mysterious nature of tea.
Over the course of After Yang, Jake finds himself coming to terms with the loss of his family's android, the eponymous Yang. He does this by viewing Yang's memories as a sort of impressionistic montage that the film itself likens to a movie.
Are you watching a movie?
The film is about mediated existence, with characters sharing dinner over screens, and the implication is that the android Yang has attained a sort of humanity through the simple act of watching. This is itself a humanity that Jake recognizes through his own viewing. While we're on the subject of After Yang, it's worth acknowledging that Kogonada has acknowledged that this aspect of the film was inspired by Edward Yang's Yi Yi, in which a character argues that the advent of movies has allowed individuals to live multiple lives over the course of a single lifetime. A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey is also about mediation, in that it is literally about characters venturing into their own path through magic doors. But even within that framework, a lot of that exploration is done through art. Navigating a museum late at night, revisiting a high school musical. These are characters who understand the universe and each other through performance. A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey has what might charitably be described as big theater kid energy. But even more broadly, if you look at the form of Kogonada's films, they are very, very, very fixated on the idea of mediation. He often shoots characters through glass or windows. He often frames them within the frame itself. Characters are often glimpsed through mirrors or reflections. However, while Kogonada is quite traditionalist in his aesthetics,
It's not very modernist though, is it?
he is not inherently nostalgic. Kogonada has talked about how the influence of legendary Japanese director Ozu is more than just an affectation. It is a philosophy.
For me, I think Ozu, the reason why I appreciate him is not in a fetishistic way, but I think he was trying to ask, how can we be modern and not lose our soul?
Kogonada's films are about modernity and offer a very forward-looking idea of what media can be. There's an extended monologue in Columbus from Gabriel, a tertiary character, about how video games can be art.
Are we losing interest in things that matter? Words on a page, for instance. But yeah, see, maybe that's not so important. What about everyday life? Are we losing interest in everyday life?
The memories that are presented in After Yang play like looped TikTok clips or YouTube supercuts. In this way, Kogonada offers what might be called a sort of modernist classicism, an argument that traditional approaches to art can embrace more modern modes and sensibilities, which feels like a fusion of older filmmaking and a contemporary internet media mindset. There is perhaps a little more cynicism in the work of the Philippou brothers.
Are you serious? Put your phones down! Put your fucking phones away!
It is reductive to suggest that Talk to Me and Bring Her Back are films about the internet in any substantive or exclusive way. The central horror of Talk to Me, a strange cursed artifact that allows the user to commune with the dead that drives teenagers into isolation and madness, can be read as a metaphor for any number of things, such as drug addiction, depression, or unprocessed trauma. However, it is also a handheld object that can warp the user's reality and cut them off from their friends and family, so it's not too hard to read it as a metaphor for the internet. It's also worth noting that Mia is motivated to take that creepy ghost hand after she notices that her best friend and her ex are holding hands, suggesting that her destructive behavior is motivated by a somewhat literal disconnect from the people in the real world around her. So the creepy ghost hand reaches out to disaffected teenagers and lures them into a creepy hell dimension where they can be preyed upon by creepy old people. Maybe this is more about the internet than I thought it was. And outside of the creepy hand, the only device that connects Mia to her deceased mother is her phone, creating an equivalence between the two.
I know.
I mean, I don't actually have to play the clip here, do I? More to the point though, the Philippous are the rare modern directors who understand how young people use phones, and how much of their relationship with reality is mediated through that. While the film's style is largely traditional and old-fashioned, looking like a classic horror movie, the teenagers in Talk to Me feel like modern kids. They are constantly on their phones, recording, and sharing, and scrolling. It is not necessarily what the film is about, but it reflects an understanding of the modern world that is often missing from more ostensibly modern horror movies. Even on a basic narrative level, at a time when it's commonplace to hear complaints that phones have ruined horror movies, it's refreshing to watch a scary film from two filmmakers who come from a background that requires them to understand how phones work.
Film me?
In Talk to Me, there's a palpable push and pull, a fear and a desire to be rendered as content.
Delete it. Delete it, come on! Yeah, nah.
As such, it's appropriate that the arcane artifact that propels the plot of Bring Her Back is not some occult diary or spell book or Necronomicon. It is instead grainy camcorder footage from Russia distributed over the dark web, the sort of modern twist on a classic horror trope that makes sense coming from filmmakers who experienced Rotten.com firsthand. You can even read the URL in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Like the movies made by Kogonada, Bring Her Back and Talk to Me are heavily mediated films, and not just because they literally feature mediums. This brings us neatly to Chris Stuckman and Shelby Oaks, which is handily the most frustrating of these movies. It's worth acknowledging from the outset that Stuckman is perhaps operating at a disadvantage compared to his contemporaries when it comes to basic filmmaking craft. Unlike the Philippou brothers or Patrick Willems, Stuckman's YouTube videos aren't especially ambitious in a filmmaking sense. And unlike Kogonada, his video output isn't especially visual in its presentation. In his film reviews, Stuckman doesn't seem like a guy who has thought a lot about shot composition and lighting. This, by the way, is perfectly fine. That's not Stuckman's appeal. Stuckman is an intelligent, approachable, and charming reviewer who speaks rather directly to his audience, and he does that very well. He seems nice, and he's a very easy guy to like, and it's hard to undersell just how appealing that is. The point is more that it's clearly a sharper learning curve to directing a feature film going from Stuckman's videos than it would be from the Raka Raka shorts or even Kogonada's video essays. Even just watching his YouTube videos, it's clear that Stuckman hasn't thought as much about where he wants the camera to be as Kogonada has, and he hasn't considered how the camera can move in the same way that the Philippou brothers have. There's an unresolved tension in Shelby Oaks between what the movie is about and how the movie is about it. To put it bluntly, Shelby Oaks just doesn't look as good as the films by Kogonada or the Philippou brothers. It has that flat digital sheen that seems to be the default for every streaming movie, and which looks far too polished for a grungy horror film. This look is also at odds with what the film is about thematically. Much like other films by YouTubers turned filmmakers, Shelby Oaks is in some ways about the transition from one media form to the other. The film follows the disappearance of a bunch of YouTubers in the eponymous abandoned community. In a clever stylistic touch, the opening act of Shelby Oaks, roughly the first 28 minutes of the film, is presented as a streaming crime documentary about that disappearance. Here, the sheen kind of works. It looks like every other generic streaming documentary. In this opening act, it kind of feels like a lesser version of Stuart Ortez's Strange Harvest, the recent horror mockumentary, which felt like an extrapolation of the Blair Witch Project into the streaming documentary age. Then, Stuckman makes what is, on paper, a very clever conceptual choice, stepping out of the documentary and into a more conventional narrative feature. It's a very clever structural conceit that works as a metaphor for the film itself. This is a film about a director moving from YouTube to theatrical horror, and the film itself moves from a streaming documentary into a more recognizable horror film. The big problem is that, to put it frankly, Stuckman doesn't seem to have the skill to make that leap tangible. The conventional horror movie part of the film looks too much like the streaming documentary part, which cuts the legs out from under it. I'm wary of being a bit mean about Stuckman here. Debut films are meant to be rough around the edges, they're meant to be learning curves. I've certainly sat through worse debut films. In fact, I've sat through worse debut films this month. At least Chris Stuckman didn't ask maybe the greatest living actor of his generation to deliver a monologue that culminates in the line,
"And I manured him."
So at least there's that. However, the problem is that we're discussing Shelby Oaks in the context of some of the more interesting debut films of the past decade, Columbus and Talk to Me. And the movie lacks the technical craft that made those two films so interesting and so compelling to discuss. If we're being charitable, the lack of texture in the second and third acts to distinguish them from the streaming content first act is perhaps the point of the exercise. When Keith David shows up in the second act to offer an exposition dump in the sequence that is shot just like Michael Beach's exposition dump in the documentary in the first act, it feels almost deliberate. This is essentially Stuckman demonstrating, whether intentionally or not, what Martin Scorsese argued about homogeneity in the era of content. when everything is the same, when a Super Bowl commercial becomes indistinguishable from a feature film, becomes indistinguishable from a TV show.
This isn't a movie. No. It's a tourism ad for Australia. Yes.
Here, a streaming true crime documentary and a debut horror movie from an aspiring young filmmaker are practically interchangeable. It's all content, baby! As in the work of the Philippou brothers or Kogonada, mediation is central to Shelby Oaks. When the monster appears in the first act, it is glimpsed through windows and reflected in turned-off television sets. A cracked pane of glass is a recurring motif, suggesting the breakdown of barriers between layers of reality. When the third act of Shelby Oaks reaches a big twist that it lacks the grounding to properly exploit, it's only logical that the real horror at the heart of the film is the reveal of a content creator who is tied up and forced to endlessly create. It is, in that sense, even more directly than Talk to Me or Bring Her Back, a YouTube horror movie. That's what's really interesting about this wave of directors who have emerged from YouTube. They are, in many ways, more traditional and old-fashioned than one might expect of a generation that cut their teeth in new media. In style, the kinds of movies being made by creators who emerge from internet media are much more traditional than the kinds of movies that Hollywood is making in the hopes of courting the audience that watches internet media. However, their films also demonstrate a set of perspectives, ideas, and anxieties that reflect their background. These may not be movies as aggressively about creating internet media as something like Unfriended or Searching, but they do reflect a modern perspective inside a classical framework. These films are all about the idea of mediation, but in a more artful and thoughtful way than just literally putting a computer screen on screen. One way or another, these are all films that find a way to strike a balance between cinema's past and its most likely future. And that, if nothing else, is a vision worth liking and subscribing to. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.
And now, Grand Hotel. But first, a word from our alternate sponsor. Friends, do you have wobbly dentures?